Dan McLellan keeps repeating two hermeneutical statements without ever explaining the hermeneutics behind them. Now his followers lap it up, and I know from their comments on this account that they don't understand the issue. Whether Dan understands the issue, who's to say? He never talks about it, at least not hermeneutically. He just keeps repeating the claims, and I think it's problematic, and therefore if you're interested in what he does, you should be interested in this video. The two statements are this. On the one hand, he says, there is no such thing as inherent meaning in a text. On the other hand, this is the other statement, he says, we need to renegotiate the meaning of the text as interpreters. So, of course, we could immediately ask, which one is it? Is there meaning to be renegotiated, or is there no inherent meaning? How does this work? And his assumption seems to be that there cannot be inherent meaning in a text, because otherwise we wouldn't have to interpret. The fact that we have to interpret means it cannot be inherent in the text. That's a big mistake. Both statements are ultimately nonsensical, and I'm going to show why and why you should be careful about this kind of thinking. By the way, this video is not for Dan McLellan's followers. This is for you if you are interested in the issue because you think some traditional ways of doing things in theology aren't good enough. And just to be clear, you would be right in that. If you want to overcome dogmatic thinking in theology, which I applaud, you have to ask yourself not just does data overcome dogma, but rather what do we do with the data? How do we interpret it? That's the irony in this. Data is supposed to take over, but data needs to be interpreted. But when you have to interpret the Bible like anything else, then apparently it's a problem. And you try and fix the situation by taking charge of meaning. You renegotiate it, so now it's your meaning. You try and solve it by taking meaning away from the empirical author and putting it in the hands of the interpreter. Do you remember how they taught you in high school that communication is like a quarterback who throws the ball to a receiver, and somehow you have to find meaning in the quarterback? And that is laughably wrong. It is so rudimentary, it cannot possibly work. And I understand that progressive hermeneutics wants to argue against that. The trouble is, what we end up with is just as bad as the opposite. Now you have a new fundamentalism that's actually just the opposite of the old one, and it's no better than the old one, frankly. Ironically, those of Dan McLellan's followers who've interacted with me over this, because I've done a few videos on it, they don't really understand the issue. They simply keep telling me that Dan's aware of it all, and Dan makes it all clear and all the rest of it, but no one can ever show me any evidence of that. Now, I've had comments coming out of my ears from people who defend Dan and who say every meaning has to be interpreted in order to be used or understood and so on. Well, obviously, we know that. There's hardly anything new about that. That's not the question. The question is, where is meaning located? Once you realize it's not in the empirical author, do you then locate it in the interpreter, or do you locate it in the text? And that's what we're going to figure out today in this video. Communication starts with an actual flesh and blood person. I guess it could be an animal too, but let's stick with humans. So an actual person creates an act of communication, and that means that communication is now embodied in some kind of physical form. It could be a facial expression, it could be a text, it could be a billboard, it could be a building. Somebody comes along and wants to interpret any of these things. That's our scenario. So how does interpretation work? And it's not what your high school teacher told you. It goes like this. As soon as the empirical author has created an utterance, spoken, painted something, built something, facial expression, billboard, you name it, written a text, as soon as that person has done that, they stop acting as a relevant author for purposes of interpretation. If that weren't the case, we would never be able to interpret anything for which we don't have the original empirical author available. So nothing that's old would be available to us for interpretation. Meaning cannot remain in the empirical author. The whole point is that the author, by creating an utterance, transferred meaning that is now embodied in the thing that we're going to interpret. Are you with me? From that point forward, the empirical author is basically a former author. If they were able to join you and help you interpret what they said, what they uttered before, they would be a fellow interpreter alongside you. They should be privileged, really, because they were the ones who originally created the utterance, so they should be a better interpreter than you are. But basically, the important thing here is they are no longer an author relevant for interpretation. So we cannot place meaning in that person. Meaning has been transferred to or embodied in the act of communication, the utterance, whatever physical shape it took. Put differently, even if you had the privilege of having the original empirical author sitting next to you now as a fellow interpreter, that person would have to show that the meaning they're explaining to you is actually reflective of the thing that they had produced at that prior point. So even if they were the original empirical author, they are now, as interpreter, bound by what they had produced at the time. They cannot change it. That is done. That act of communication is complete. They could try and counteract it by creating a new act of communication that maybe contradicts what they said earlier, but they cannot change what they had said. That act of communication is complete. So remember, the empirical author created meaning. That's all that person is able to do. From that point forward, that person no longer has a role as author. The only role they could have is as fellow interpreter. Now, in the situation of a dialogue, there are multiple empirical authors who take turns. The roles go back and forth between author and interpreter, but again, the same dynamic applies. The other difference in a dialogue situation is that you now have an empirical audience also. You have both empirical author and empirical audience. Now, in Dan McLellan's hermeneutical soundbites, which to my knowledge he never actually explains, he transfers meaning to that person, to the empirical audience, and that is the first big mistake here. Now, his code for that sounds kind of sexy, to renegotiate meaning, and people lap it all up. Now, to renegotiate meaning would be quite the privilege for the empirical audience, but in fact, not even the empirical author who shows up as a fellow interpreter in a given situation has that privilege, because that meaning is already enshrined. That person cannot say, oh, you think I meant that, but I actually now mean this by what I said then. That makes no sense. It's disingenuous. Like in a courtroom situation, there's no way a court would let you get away with that. Imagine for a second you're in that situation and you're saying to the presiding judge, Your Honor, I'm renegotiating my prior meaning. You have to go with this now rather than that then. There's a reason, by the way, why we cannot undo prior speech acts, as we call them. The reason is, by using speech, we are creating new realities. We are actual creators of new stuff. And you cannot then pretend you didn't do that. You didn't create it. It's out there. It's in the air. It has a physical embodiment. At least it did at the time. And even if it was that lone voice in the wood and nobody hears it, it still physically happened. And if it was just a thought, it also physically happened. Ask a neuroscientist what happens in the brain when we do this. In a nutshell, it is not possible to communicate and not create a new reality, and therefore it is also not possible to deny that afterward. Now imagine the moral implications of this. If it were possible to renegotiate prior meaning, people never would have to take responsibility for threats and things they uttered in the past. It's basically a laughable notion. You can counteract prior meaning, but you can never change it or pretend it didn't happen, because a new reality was created at that point. And now you can try and mitigate that reality by creating a better reality, but you can never undo what happened. There are two quintessentially human things we can never get out of. We will always communicate, and by doing so, we will always create. We cannot not be creators. The one thing we cannot be, however, is uncreators. And that reality by itself easily pulls the rug from any notion of renegotiating meaning. We can, however, interpret. In fact, we cannot not interpret, but that's rather different from renegotiating meaning, which is an impossibility. So earlier I mentioned the situation of a dialogue. So what you have there is an empirical author who speaks and creates meaning. At the same time, there's a counterpart, an empirical audience, also flesh and blood, and they try and interpret. And then the roles reverse. But here's the thing. Just like the empirical author creates an implied author, not a flesh and blood person, but something created, a vantage point basically, created and embedded in the thing being said. So the empirical audience has to get into the role of the implied audience, which is always the perfect counterpart to the implied author. That is what interpretation means. Interpretation is that you can figure out what kind of vantage point you are supposed to adopt at the receiving end. And it's the vantage point that is the perfect counterpart to the implied author created by the empirical author. So meaning is actually embodied on the implied level and not the empirical level. That's important. The empirical level is just a symbol of the meaning inherent in it. And there you have it. There is inherent meaning. Let's put it this way. In a dialogue situation between two people, you have four authors and four audiences. Two of the authors are empirical, they're flesh and blood people, and they take turns speaking, and two of them are implied. So whatever speaking happens by the empirical author gets embodied in the text or in the speech by using language or some kind of physical manifestation. Whatever gets created by those empirical authors is embodied in that thing they're creating, whether it's speech, sound waves, or text, or whatever. And then you have the audiences, the empirical people, the empirical audiences are supposed to get into the minds of the implied author. And if they succeed at that, they're interpreting. But just remember that implied authors and implied audiences are not flesh and blood people. Those are constructs that we use our minds to get into. That's interpretation. The empirical people are flesh and blood, but they are not the ones who keep holding on to meaning once they've created it. So now we know that there is inherent meaning in the text, and we also know that that meaning has to be interpreted. And therefore, those who argue that the need for interpretation shows there's no inherent meaning, they lost the plot. Now, let's assume for a moment you're reading something, and as you're reading it and interpreting it, the actual empirical author of that piece walks in on you. That person is no longer the empirical author. That person is now a fellow empirical interpreter of yours, or of the work that he or she created, I should say. And consequently, if they try to explain to you what they meant at the time when they authored this empirically, you are free to accept that or not accept it. You could, for instance, say, that's not what you said. And the person might say, but I'm saying it now. Well, that's a new act of communication. You can't confuse the two. For remember, the fact that they were the creator originally does not mean that they can now uncreate it. It's not possible. If this weren't the case, we would never need such a thing as apologies, because we would simply go back and renegotiate what we created at the time. But it doesn't work. It's not a thing. If I wanted help from a fellow interpreter with understanding something that was written in the past, and that person said to me, I'm now renegotiating that meaning, I would say, pound sand, I'm not interested. If somebody insulted me in the past and now they come to me and instead of apologizing, they say, don't worry, I'm going to uninsult you now, then I'm really going to be insulted. Not least because it's an assault on my intellect. Let's assume you built a stupid house some years ago. You don't like it anymore. It's ugly. Can you now renegotiate it? No, you can change it, you can add to it, you can try and make it less ugly or something. You can also pull it down and use the debris or not use the debris from that and build something new. Whatever the case may be, you cannot renegotiate it. It's the same with any act of creation, and meaning creation is no different. If you build a stupid looking house some years ago and now you pull it down and it is no more, you have not undone the reality of that house having sat there for 10 years. Listen, people, this isn't rocket science. We have brains, let's use them. Let's assume you want to build a swimming pool, but accidentally you actually build, I don't know, a movie theater or something. Can you now renegotiate that and go swimming in that renegotiated thing? Good luck with that. Now, on the other hand, if you do tear it down and you use the debris to build something new, you are reauthoring. You are the new author and the whole thing starts over again. So I have watched videos by Dan McLellan where he stitches someone and he defends himself and he says to that person, this is not what I said. What I really said is this. Now, he's not renegotiating his own meaning at that point. He's clarifying what his implied author said. So at some level, Dan must be accepting this. He just never talks about it, and he doesn't seem to realize that the notion of renegotiation runs roughshod through that whole thing. So I accidentally just said run roughshod through that whole thing instead of run roughshod over that whole thing. Can I renegotiate what I said? No, I made a mistake. It's done. I can't change it. All I can do is clarify for you what I should have said. We still have one more thing to do. We have to figure out where meaning resides. And remember that high school thing, quarterback throws ball to receiver? The ball is the text, the quarterback is the speaker, the receiver is the person who interprets. Well, we now know that meaning is actually contained in the ball that is in the text. And we know that the shape it takes is the dialogue between implied author and implied audience of the text. That's where meaning resides. Now let's figure this out some more. Let's see what difference that makes for interpretation. Interpretation is all about the implicit dialogue between implied author and implied audience. As an interpreter, you need to get into the mind of the implied audience, and by doing that, you're the perfect reactor to the implied author, and now you're interpreting. So let's apply this. If you go, for instance, to Ephesians, and some scholars believe Ephesians wasn't written by Paul, the point is this: the implied author of Ephesians is absolutely Paul. So even if the guy who wrote it was called Fritz or something, he still wanted the empirical audience to adopt the vantage point of an implied audience that's listening to Paul. And that is what we need for interpretation. Therefore, if people get all worked up about was Ephesians written by Paul or not, I already know they don't understand hermeneutics. Or take the example of Luke Acts. That's a particularly good one, because Luke Acts doesn't tell us who wrote it, neither do the other Gospels. Acts is part of a Gospel, the one by Luke. Do I know it's Luke? I do not. That was subsequent centuries when they said it was a guy called Luke. So because people can't differentiate between empirical author and implied, they always look for the empirical. So they want to make sure that they think it was written by Luke because somebody said so 100 years later. So now they claim to know the name is all on very shaky ground. Now, so what? What difference does that make for interpretation? Zero. But wait, there is more. They then say, ooh, there's a Luke in Colossians 4, and he's a physician. It must be the same Luke. So there you go. You just build your sandcastle here just before the flood comes in, right? So now we know that Luke Acts was written by Dr. Luke. Now it affects their interpretation because every time there's a miracle story, they say something like, look at that. It's a miracle story. A doctor had no interest in miracles. It would be counterproductive for business, right? So the fact that Dr. Luke says it was a miracle means it must have happened. What I care about is how badly we slaughter the process of interpretation here. It doesn't matter whether the guy was called Luke or not. It doesn't matter whether the guy was a physical doctor or not. It doesn't matter for interpreting the miracles or anything else in that narrative. What really matters is the implied author. And the implied author of Luke Acts was definitely not a doctor. The implied author of Luke Acts was a guy who understood that the theology of Israel needed to be made relevant to non-Jews who thought wrongly that they had to become Jews to be part of the kingdom of God. So Luke writes Luke Acts and shows conclusively that that is not necessary. What you need is Jesus, that's all. So I just interpreted the implied author of Luke Acts. I don't need to know the guy's name empirically. I don't need to know what profession he had. This is not about belief. This is about interpretation. That's always got to be the first step, because if you do not interpret first, what good is it if you then pronounce judgment on it? I like it, I don't like it, it's a fraud or whatever. Unless you interpret first and you interpret well, everything else is irrelevant. One more example. People go to Romans 7 where Paul says, what a wretched man I am, such a sinner, and so on. And they think Paul is talking about himself, when in fact Paul is adopting the vantage point of Israel. He's speaking on behalf of Israel. And by the way, Mary in the Magnificat in Luke does the exact same thing. Why do you think both of these texts are so full of Israel terminology? If we get implied and empirical wrong, we screw up the text. And then people go to Romans 7 and they think Paul was talking about himself, and they preach inspiring sermons about Paul. Look at the guy, even he had these faith struggles. Isn't that inspiring to us? We can overcome if we're just like him. And the problem is the text says nothing about any of that. It's not interested in that. The text is about Israel and about what it means to be truly God's people. And now you have a challenge for God's people, and otherwise you just have an individual who's being inspiring. And this is why I keep saying that people slaughter the text. Pastors do it, preachers do it, publishers do it, people who speak, people who read, people who talk to each other. We slaughter the text, and we don't know we're doing it. We have no idea we're doing it because we don't understand hermeneutics. So if you're interested in evaluating the claims of religion, theology, faith, and so on, the first thing you have to do is the first thing you have to do in all communication, is you have to interpret it well. If you don't do that, what good is it if you pass judgment on stuff? At this point, I haven't said much at all about the practical applicability of this, but I could do. I have an entire course on it. It's called The Narrative Experience. If you're interested, get in touch with me. It pays to become better interpreters. And those Christians who claim that the Bible is ever so important to them, they should be the first in line to do this. I came across a car wreck on the interstate the other day. It was up in Oklahoma. And I stopped, and people were still in their cars, all mangled and stuff. And I helped get some of them out. When I talked to them, I did not talk to them as a scholar of interpretation, which I am empirically. I talked to them as a fellow human being. And I really hope that they understood who my implied author was, rather than the empirical guy. So ask yourself, do you want to treat the text with integrity, interpretive integrity, or do you want to renegotiate meaning? One of those is a must. The other is an impossibility. If you're a theology student who doesn't have access to a decent hermeneutics class and they're hard to find, text me. If you're a so-called layperson and you're really interested in becoming a better Bible reader and understander, text me.